In a world where uniforms tell stories and insignias reveal destinies, sometimes the most extraordinary warriors hide in plain sight. What happens when decades of service, sacrifice, and silent heroism are reduced to a single moment of judgment? When those in power see only what they expect to see, dismissing legends as ordinary, this is the story of a woman who served her country with distinction, earned respect through blood and sweat, and carried secrets that could change the course of military history. But on one fateful day, when bureaucracy met bravery, when assumptions clashed with reality, and when a single general's keen eye pierced through layers of deception and prejudice, everything changed. Some stories begin with action, others with mystery. This one begins with a mistake that nearly cost the military one of its most valuable assets. A mistake that revealed how quickly society can forget its heroes and how powerfully truth can emerge when least expected. The insignia was there all along. The question is, would anyone be brave enough to truly see it? Margaret Chen stood in the sterile hallway of the Veterans Affairs building, her weathered hands clutching a manila folder containing 32 years of her life. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting harsh shadows across her face that revealed every line earned through decades of service in places most people couldn't pronounce, let alone locate on a map. The young clerk behind the bulletproof glass barely looked up from her computer screen as Margaret approached the window. At 61, Margaret had learned to read people quickly, a skill that had kept her alive in hostile territories from Afghanistan to Somalia. This clerk saw her as just another aging veteran seeking benefits, another face in an endless parade of requests and paperwork. Next, the clerk called mechanically, her voice flat with the kind of boredom that comes from processing hundreds of similar cases each week. Margaret stepped forward, sliding her folder through the metal slot beneath the glass. "I'm here about my benefits review," Margaret said quietly, her voice carrying the measured tone of someone accustomed to giving orders, though few would recognize it now. She wore a simple navy blazer over dark slacks, her silver hair pulled back in a neat bun. Nothing about her appearance screamed military, nothing that would make a casual observer look twice. The clerk opened the folder with practiced indifference, her eyes scanning the documents with the speed of someone who had seen it all before. Margaret Chen, born 1965, enlisted 1990, she muttered, typing information into her computer. "Says here you served as a supply coordinator?" The way she said it made it sound insignificant, almost dismissive. Margaret's jaw tightened slightly, but she remained silent. The truth was buried in classified files that this clerk would never see. Files that detailed operations in places that didn't officially exist. Missions that had saved countless American lives and prevented international incidents from escalating into full-scale wars. "It says you're requesting full disability benefits for PTSD and physical injuries sustained in service," the clerk continued, her tone suggesting skepticism. "But I'm looking at your file and I don't see any combat decorations. Most of your service record shows logistics and administrative work. Are you sure you're filing the right claim?" Margaret felt the familiar tightness in her chest, the same sensation she experienced when bureaucrats tried to minimize her service. She had encountered this before, this assumption that because her official records showed mundane duties, her actual service had been mundane too. The truth was far more complex. "I believe my file is complete," Margaret replied, her voice steady despite the frustration building inside her. "I served in multiple theaters of operation and sustained injuries in the line of duty." The clerk's expression grew more skeptical. "Ma'am, I've processed thousands of these cases. I can usually tell when someone's trying to exaggerate their service for better benefits. Your record shows you were basically a desk jockey who occasionally got deployed to handle supply chains. The psychological evaluation notes suggest possible exaggeration of symptoms consistent with that evaluation was conducted by someone who doesn't understand the nature of my service."
Margaret interrupted, her calm beginning to crack.
"The injuries I sustained were real. The trauma I experienced was real. The fact that my official record doesn't reflect certain aspects of my service doesn't make those experiences less valid." The clerk leaned back in her chair, clearly unconvinced. "Look, Mrs. Chen, I understand that everyone wants to feel like their service was important. But the facts are the facts. According to your file, you never saw combat. You worked in supply chains and administrative roles. While I'm sure that was valuable work, it doesn't typically result in the kind of severe PTSD you're claiming." Margaret's hands clenched into fists at her sides. How could she explain that some of the supplies she coordinated were weapons deliveries to covert operatives? How could she describe the administrative work that involved managing intelligence networks in hostile territories? How could she make this clerk understand that her desk job had often been performed in bombed-out buildings while enemy forces searched for her? "I have documentation supporting my claims," Margaret said, reaching into her blazer and pulling out a sealed envelope. "These are statements from commanding officers who can verify the nature of my service." The clerk glanced at the envelope but didn't take it. "Ma'am, unless these statements are from official channels and properly documented in your military record, they don't carry much weight. Anyone can write a letter claiming anything. We have to go by official documentation." Margaret's frustration reached a boiling point. She had spent decades serving her country in ways that couldn't be publicly acknowledged, taking on assignments that put her life at risk repeatedly, all while maintaining a cover that made her appear to be nothing more than a logistics specialist. Now, in her time of need, that same cover was being used against her. "I want to speak to a supervisor," Margaret said firmly. The clerk sighed dramatically as if this request was the most unreasonable thing she had heard all day. "The supervisor is going to tell you the same thing I'm telling you. Your claim is being processed based on your official record, and that record doesn't support the level of benefits you're requesting. You can appeal the decision when it comes through, but I'd recommend adjusting your expectations." Margaret stared at the young woman through the bulletproof glass, seeing in her eyes the same dismissive attitude she had encountered from bureaucrats throughout her career. It was the look that said her service didn't matter, that her sacrifices were insignificant, that her pain was exaggerated or fabricated. "Fine," Margaret said quietly, taking back her folder. "I'll wait for the official decision." As she walked away from the window, Margaret felt the weight of every injury, every sleepless night, every moment of terror she had experienced in service to her country. The shrapnel still embedded in her left shoulder ached constantly, a reminder of the explosion that had nearly killed her during a supposedly routine supply run in Iraq. The psychological scars ran deeper, memories of friends lost in operations that officially never happened, of decisions she had made that saved lives but haunted her dreams. She sat down in one of the uncomfortable plastic chairs in the waiting area, watching as other veterans went through similar processes. Some were clearly former infantry, their bearing and demeanor unmistakably military. Others, like herself, blended into the background, their service histories hidden behind classifications and cover stories. Margaret thought about her daughter Sarah, who was struggling to pay for her college tuition. She thought about the mounting medical bills from treatments for injuries that officially didn't exist. She thought about the small apartment she could barely afford on her meager retirement income, a stark contrast to the comfortable life she had imagined after 3 decades of service. The irony wasn't lost on her. She had spent years protecting secrets, maintaining cover identities, and ensuring that critical operations remained hidden from public view. Now, that very secrecy was preventing her from receiving the benefits she had earned through blood and sacrifice. Margaret pulled out her phone and scrolled through her contacts until she found the number for Lieutenant Colonel James Rodriguez, one of her former commanding officers, who had repeatedly urged her to fight for proper recognition of her service. She had resisted his advice before, not wanting to rock the boat or draw attention to operations that were still classified. But sitting in that sterile waiting room, dismissed and diminished by someone who had never heard a shot fired in anger, she felt her resolve hardening. She was about to dial his number when her phone buzzed with an incoming call from an unknown number. Margaret hesitated for a moment before answering. "This is Margaret Chen." "Mrs. Chen, this is Colonel Patricia Williams from the Inspector General's office. I understand you've been having some difficulty with your benefits review. I wonder if you might have some time to discuss your case in person. There are some aspects of your service record that require clarification, and I believe a face-to-face meeting would be beneficial." Margaret's heart skipped a beat. Calls from the Inspector General's office were never routine, and the formal tone suggested this was about more than just a benefits dispute. "When would you like to meet, Colonel? Are you available this afternoon?" "I'm currently at Fort Belvoir, about 40 minutes from your location. I can arrange for a car to pick you up if transportation is an issue." Margaret glanced around the waiting room, then back at the clerk who had dismissed her so casually. Something significant was happening, something that went beyond her individual case. "I can be ready in an hour." "Excellent. The car will be a black sedan with government plates. The driver will have proper identification. Mrs. Chen, I want you to know that your service has not gone unnoticed by everyone. There are people who understand the true nature of what you've done for this country." After hanging up, Margaret sat back in her chair, her mind racing. Colonel Williams' words suggested that someone, somewhere in the military hierarchy, understood the real story of her service. But why now? Why was the Inspector General's office suddenly interested in her case? She looked down at her folder. at the sanitized version of her military career that reduced 3 decades of sacrifice to a series of mundane job descriptions. Hidden within those pages, between the lines of official documentation, lay a story that few people would ever know. But perhaps, finally, someone in a position of authority was ready to read between those lines. Margaret stood up and walked back to the clerk's window. The young woman looked up with barely concealed annoyance. "Yes? Did you forget something?" "I just wanted you to know," Margaret said quietly, "that sometimes the most important stories are the ones that can't be written down. Sometimes the people you dismiss as ordinary are the ones who've done the most extraordinary things. You might want to remember that." The clerk stared at her blankly, clearly not understanding the significance of what Margaret was saying. But Margaret didn't need her to understand. In an hour, she would be in a car heading to meet someone who might finally recognize the true value of her service. As she walked toward the exit, Margaret caught her reflection in the glass doors. For just a moment, she allowed herself to stand a little straighter, to let a hint of the soldier she had always been show through the civilian disguise she had worn for so long. The insignia might be hidden, but the warrior remained. The afternoon sun felt warm on her face as she stepped outside, and for the first time in months, Margaret Chen allowed herself to hope that justice might finally be within reach. She didn't know it yet, but her meeting with Colonel Williams would set in motion a series of events that would not only secure her benefits, but also expose a systematic problem in how the military treated its most classified veterans. Behind her, the VA building continued its mundane operations, clerks processing files and making decisions based on incomplete information, never realizing that they had just encountered a legend. The black sedan pulled up to the curb exactly 1 hour later, its government plates gleaming under the afternoon sun. Margaret had changed into her most formal outfit, a navy blue dress with a blazer that she reserved for important occasions. As she approached the vehicle, the driver stepped out and opened the rear door for her. "Mrs. Chen? I'm Sergeant Martinez. Colonel Williams is expecting you." The drive to Fort Belvoir was quiet, giving Margaret time to think about what might await her. She had served under numerous commanders throughout her career, but few had reached the rank of colonel in the Inspector General's office. That position carried significant weight, suggesting that her case had somehow attracted high-level attention. Fort Belvoir appeared ahead, its imposing gates and security checkpoints a familiar sight from her active duty days. As they passed through the entrance, Margaret felt a complex mix of emotions. These military installations had been her home for so long, places where she belonged without question. Now, as a veteran seeking recognition, she felt like an outsider trying to prove her worth. The sedan stopped in front of a nondescript administrative building, and Sergeant Martinez led her through security and up to the 3rd floor. The hallways were filled with the sounds of military efficiency, phones ringing, keyboards clicking, and the measured footsteps of personnel moving with purpose. Colonel Williams's office was at the end of the hall, her name and title clearly displayed on a brass nameplate. Margaret knocked and heard a crisp "Enter" from inside. Colonel Patricia Williams stood as Margaret entered, immediately moving from behind her desk to greet her visitor. She was a woman in her early 50s, with short graying hair and intelligent brown eyes that seemed to take in every detail. Her uniform was impeccable, adorned with ribbons that spoke of extensive combat experience and multiple deployments. "Chen, thank you for coming on such short notice. Please, have a seat." Colonel Williams gestured to a comfortable chair opposite her desk, then poured 2 cups of coffee from a carafe on a side table. "I hope you don't mind, but I took the liberty of reviewing your complete file before this meeting." Margaret accepted the coffee gratefully, noting the emphasis on the word complete. "I assume that means more than what the VA clerk had access to." Colonel Williams smiled grimly. "Considerably more, Mrs. Chen. I'm going to be direct with you because I believe you've earned the right to straight talk. Your case came to my attention through some unusual channels. It seems that someone has been tracking denied or reduced benefit claims for veterans with classified service records. The pattern that emerged was disturbing." She moved back to her desk and pulled out a thick folder, much larger than the one Margaret carried. "What I'm about to discuss with you is classified, but given your clearance level and involvement in these operations, I'm authorized to share this information. Your official record, the one that civilian clerks see, shows that you served as a logistics coordinator and administrative specialist." "That's true, but it's only about 10% of the story." Colonel Williams opened the folder and began reading from a document marked with classification stamps. Sergeant Chen was assigned to Joint Special Operations Command from 1995 to 2018, operating under deep cover in multiple theaters. Her primary role was establishing and maintaining supply chains for covert operations, a position that required her to operate independently in hostile territory for extended periods. Margaret felt her breath catch. Someone was finally reading the real story of her service. During her assignment in Afghanistan, Sergeant Chen successfully maintained supply lines for Special Forces operations while operating under constant threat of discovery. She survived 3 separate attempts on her life, including a bombing that left her with permanent shoulder damage and recurring medical issues. Her work directly contributed to the success of Operation Enduring Freedom by ensuring that critical supplies reached special operations teams in remote locations. Colonel Williams looked up from the file. Mrs. Chen, according to this record, you speak 4 languages fluently and operated in 12 different countries under various cover identities. You were responsible for coordinating the delivery of not just supplies but weapons, intelligence materials, and extraction resources for high-value operations. Is this accurate?
Yes, ma'am. Margaret replied, her voice thick with emotion.
For the first time in years, someone was acknowledging what she had actually done. The psychological evaluation in your real file tells a very different story than what the VA received. It documents exposure to multiple traumatic events, including witnessing the deaths of operatives under your support, surviving direct attacks, and operating under extreme stress for extended periods. The PTSD diagnosis is not only legitimate but understated, according to the military psychologist who evaluated you. Colonel Williams closed the file and leaned forward. Mrs. Chen, you weren't just a logistics coordinator. You were a critical component of some of our most sensitive operations. The fact that you managed to maintain your cover so effectively that even our own bureaucracy doesn't recognize your service is actually a testament to how good you were at your job. But it's also a systemic failure that we need to address. Margaret felt tears welling up in her eyes, years of frustration and dismissal finally being acknowledged. Colonel, I've tried to explain this to multiple caseworkers over the years. They all see the sanitized version of my record and assume I'm exaggerating or lying about my experiences. That's exactly the problem we're dealing with, Colonel Williams said, her voice taking on an edge of anger. We've identified at least 47 cases similar to yours, veterans with classified service records who are being denied proper benefits because their cover stories are so effective that they hide their real contributions. It's a betrayal of people who sacrificed everything to serve their country in ways that can never be publicly acknowledged. She stood and walked to the window, looking out at the base where hundreds of military personnel went about their daily duties. Mrs. Chen, I'm going to ask you to do something that I know goes against every instinct you've developed over your career. I want you to break your cover, officially and completely. I want you to help us fix this system so that other classified veterans don't go through what you've experienced. Margaret's mind raced. Breaking cover meant exposing operations and methods that were still sensitive, even years after they had occurred. It meant potentially putting other operatives at risk and violating the secrecy that had been drilled into her for decades. What exactly would that involve? She asked carefully. We're assembling a task force to review the cases of all veterans with classified service records. We need someone with your experience and credibility to serve as an advisor to help us identify cases where veterans are being systematically denied benefits they've earned. Your case would serve as the foundation for a comprehensive reform of how we handle classified service records in the benefits process. Colonel Williams returned to her desk and pulled out another document. I have here an authorization from the Secretary of Defense to declassify certain portions of your service record, specifically those related to your injuries and psychological trauma. This would allow us to properly document your disability claims without compromising ongoing operations or intelligence methods. Margaret stared at the document, seeing years of hidden service finally being brought into the light. And if I agree to this, your benefits claim would be immediately approved at full disability rating. Your back pay would be calculated from the date of your initial claim. But more importantly, you would help us ensure that other veterans like yourself receive the recognition and support they've earned. The offer was everything Margaret had hoped for, but she knew there were implications beyond her personal situation. Colonel, some of the operations I was involved in were extremely sensitive. Even partial declassification could compromise ongoing activities or put people at risk. I understand your concerns, and they're valid. That's why we're being very careful about what gets declassified and what remains protected. We're not asking you to expose methods or ongoing operations. We're asking you to allow us to document the reality of your service in a way that protects both national security and your right to proper benefits. Margaret thought about the young clerk who had dismissed her so casually, about the other veterans sitting in that waiting room who might be going through similar struggles. She thought about her daughter Sarah, who was working 2 jobs to pay for college because Margaret couldn't afford to help her. Most of all, she thought about the other classified veterans who were probably being denied benefits at that very moment because their real service was hidden behind cover stories. "What would you need from me?" she asked. Colonel Williams smiled, for the first time since the meeting began. "First, we need you to provide detailed testimony about your service, which will be used to establish baseline criteria for evaluating classified veterans' claims. Second, we need you to review other cases and help us identify patterns of wrongful denials. Third, we need you to work with a team of lawyers and advocates to develop new procedures for handling these sensitive cases." She paused, studying Margaret's expression. "Mrs. Chen, I want to be clear about something. You don't owe the system anything more than you've already given. You served with distinction under extremely difficult circumstances, and you've already sacrificed more than anyone has a right to ask. If you choose to help us with this initiative, it should be because you want to help other veterans, not because you feel obligated." Margaret looked down at her hands, weathered from years of handling everything from classified documents to improvised weapons. She thought about all the young men and women she had worked with over the years, operatives who were now transitioning to civilian life with their own carefully constructed cover stories. How many of them would face the same dismissive bureaucracy she had encountered? "Colonel, there's something you should know about my service that might not be in the file," Margaret said quietly. "During my last deployment, I was responsible for coordinating the evacuation of an entire special operations team that had been compromised. The extraction point was under enemy fire, and I had to personally drive supplies and medical equipment through a combat zone to reach them." Colonel Williams leaned forward, clearly interested. "I wasn't just coordinating the supply delivery from a safe location," Margaret continued. "I was the delivery. I drove a supply truck through active combat, under fire, to reach wounded operatives who needed immediate medical attention and extraction. The official record probably shows that as a routine supply delivery, but it was anything but routine." "Were you injured during this operation?" "My vehicle was hit by an improvised explosive device about 2 kilometers from the extraction point. I was knocked unconscious, and when I came to, the truck was burning and enemy forces were moving toward my position. I managed to retrieve the medical supplies and complete the delivery on foot, but the explosion damaged my shoulder and back permanently." Colonel Williams made notes as Margaret spoke. "This incident isn't properly documented in your medical record, is it?" "The official report states that I was injured during a supply delivery that came under attack. It doesn't specify that I was personally delivering those supplies in a combat zone, or that I completed the mission despite being injured in an explosion. The medals and commendations for that action are all classified because acknowledging them would reveal the nature of the operation." "Mrs. Chen, what you're describing isn't just heroic. It's the kind of action that would normally result in a Silver Star or Distinguished Service Cross. Instead, it's buried in classified files where no one can recognize it." Margaret nodded. "That's just one example, Colonel. There are dozens of similar incidents throughout my career, times when I went far beyond what any logistics coordinator would normally do because the mission required it, but none of that is visible in my official record." Colonel Williams closed the file and looked directly at Margaret. "Mrs. Chen, I want to offer you a position as Senior Advisor on Classified Veterans Affairs. It would be a civilian position with the Inspector General's office with a salary commensurate with your experience and expertise. Your primary responsibility would be overseeing the review and reform of how we handle veterans with classified service records." The offer took Margaret by surprise. She had expected help with her benefits, but she hadn't anticipated being offered a chance to rejoin the system in an official capacity. "I need you to understand what you'd be taking on," Colonel Williams continued. "This won't be easy work. You'll be fighting a bureaucracy that has been operating the same way for decades. You'll encounter resistance from people who don't want to change established procedures. You'll have to relive some of your most difficult experiences in order to help establish new policies. But you'll also have the opportunity to ensure that veterans like yourself never again have to beg for recognition of their service." Margaret sat in silence for several minutes, weighing the implications of what was being offered. It meant coming out of the shadows, abandoning the anonymity she had maintained for so long. It meant becoming the public face of an issue that affected thousands of veterans who had served in classified capacities. "I'll do it," she said finally. "But I have conditions." "Name them." "First, I want guarantees that the veterans we help will receive full benefits retroactive to their initial claims, not just from the point when we fix the system. Second, I want assurance that this initiative will have sufficient resources and authority to actually implement changes, not just make recommendations that get buried in bureaucracy. Third, I want protection for any classified veterans who come forward to help with this effort." Colonel Williams nodded approvingly. "Those are exactly the kinds of conditions someone with your experience would demand. And they're all reasonable. I can authorize the first and third immediately, and I have commitments from senior leadership regarding the second. She stood and extended her hand to Margaret. Welcome back to active service, Senior Advisor Chen. I think you're going to find this mission just as challenging as anything you faced in your classified career. As Margaret shook the colonel's hand, she felt something shift inside her. For the first time in years, she felt like a soldier again, like someone with a mission that mattered. The clerk at the VA building had dismissed her as just another aging veteran seeking handouts. In a few hours, she would begin the work of ensuring that no classified veteran would ever face that kind of dismissal again. The insignia might have been hidden for decades, but Margaret Chen was finally ready to let the world see the warrior she had always been. 3 weeks into her new position as Senior Advisor on Classified Veterans Affairs, Margaret Chen sat in a windowless conference room at Fort Belvoir, surrounded by boxes of files that represented decades of buried service records. Each folder contained a story similar to her own, veterans whose real contributions to national security were hidden behind cover stories so effective that the military's own bureaucracy couldn't recognize their sacrifices. The task force assembled around the conference table was unlike any military unit Margaret had ever worked with. Colonel Williams sat at the head of the table, flanked by Major Sarah Kim, a JAG officer specializing in military personnel law, and Dr. Robert Hayes, a clinical psychologist who had spent years treating veterans with classified trauma. Across from them sat Captain Michael Torres, an intelligence analyst who specialized in declassification procedures, and Linda Foster, a civilian advocate who had been fighting for veterans' rights for over 2 decades. Let's start with the Washington case, Colonel Williams said, opening the morning's first file. Staff Sergeant David Washington served 1998 to 2015, officially listed as a communications specialist. His benefits claim was denied last month. Quote, Major Kim read from Washington's sanitized record. According to the VA file, he served in administrative and communications roles primarily at stateside bases. No combat deployments listed, no combat-related injuries documented. He's claiming PTSD and physical disabilities related to overseas service. Captain Torres pulled out a classified folder nearly twice as thick as the official record. Washington's real record tells a different story. He was assigned to military intelligence, specializing in signals intercept in hostile territories. He operated undercover as a communications specialist while actually running covert listening posts in Afghanistan, Iraq, and Syria. Dr. Hayes leaned forward with interest. What kind of psychological evaluation did he receive? Standard PTSD screening based on his official record, Major Kim replied. The evaluator noted that Washington claimed exposure to combat situations and traumatic events, but his official service record didn't support those claims. The psychologist concluded that Washington might be confabulating or exaggerating his experiences. Margaret felt her anger rising, the same frustration she had experienced in the VA office. Let me guess. The psychologist conducting the evaluation didn't have access to his classified record. Correct, Dr. Schuber, Hayes confirmed. The evaluator was working with incomplete information, making a diagnosis based on what appeared to be inconsistencies in Washington's account of his service. Colonel Williams pulled out another document. According to his classified record, Washington was present during 17 separate attacks on his listening posts. He was wounded twice, once by shrapnel from a mortar attack and once during an evacuation under fire. He also witnessed the deaths of 6 fellow intelligence operatives during his deployments. So we have a veteran with legitimate combat trauma being dismissed as a fraud because his cover story was too effective, Linda Foster said, shaking her head. How many more cases like this are we going to find? Margaret had been reviewing similar files for weeks, and the pattern was depressingly consistent. Veterans with the most sensitive service records were being systematically denied benefits because their official records had been deliberately sanitized to protect operational security. The very system designed to protect national security was being used against the people who had risked everything to maintain that security. I've been tracking the denial rates for different categories of veterans, Captain Torres said, pulling out a chart. Veterans with standard infantry or conventional military occupational specialties have a denial rate of approximately 18% for disability claims. Veterans whose service involved classified operations have a denial rate of 67%. Doctor? Hayes whistled softly. That's not just a statistical anomaly. That's evidence of systematic discrimination against classified veterans. Margaret stood and walked to the whiteboard at the front of the room, where she had been mapping connections between the cases they were reviewing. It's worse than discrimination. It's a fundamental failure of the system to understand the nature of modern military service. We're evaluating 21st century special operations veterans using criteria designed for conventional warfare. She pointed to a cluster of cases on the board. Look at these patterns. We have intelligence operatives being treated as desk clerks, special operations support personnel being dismissed as supply workers, and covert communications specialists being written off as technicians. In every case, the veteran's real service is invisible to the people making decisions about their benefits. Colonel Williams studied the board with growing concern. Margaret, how many veterans do you estimate are affected by this problem? Based on the data we've collected so far, I'd estimate between 1,500 and 2,000 veterans have been wrongfully denied benefits due to classification issues. But the real number could be much higher because we're only seeing the ones who actually applied for benefits. Major Kim looked up from the file she was reviewing. Here's another disturbing pattern. Look at the demographic breakdown of these denied claims. A disproportionate number are women and minorities who served in classified roles. Margaret wasn't surprised by this finding. During her own service, she had noticed that women and minorities were often assigned to sensitive positions precisely because they attracted less attention in hostile environments. A woman coordinating supply deliveries was less likely to be suspected of intelligence activities than a male operative, making her more effective but also more invisible when it came time for recognition. We need to understand why this is happening, Colonel Williams said. Is it deliberate discrimination, systemic bias, or just bureaucratic incompetence? Dr. Hayes had been taking notes throughout the discussion. From what I've seen in these psychological evaluations, I think it's a combination of all three. The psychologists conducting these evaluations are trained to look for inconsistencies between a veteran's reported experiences and their official record. When they find those inconsistencies, they're taught to assume the veteran is lying or exaggerating. But what about the VA caseworkers who initially review these claims? Linda Foster asked. They're not trained psychologists. They're administrative personnel making decisions based on superficial document reviews. Margaret returned to her seat, her expression grim. That's actually the biggest part of the problem. The initial review process is designed for efficiency, not accuracy. Caseworkers have 15 minutes on average to review each claim and make a recommendation. They're looking for obvious documentation that supports the veteran's claims. If they don't see combat ribbons, Purple Hearts, or deployment records showing hostile territory service, they assume the claim is inflated. Captain Torres pulled up a computer presentation showing the VA's review process. Here's how a typical classified veteran's claim gets processed. The caseworker sees an official record showing administrative duties at relatively safe locations. The veteran claims combat-related injuries and trauma, but there's no documentation in the official file to support those claims. The caseworker flags it as potentially fraudulent and sends it for psychological evaluation. Then the psychologist, working with the same incomplete information, finds inconsistencies between the veteran's account and their official record. Dr. Hayes continued. The psychologist concludes that the veteran is either lying or suffering from false memories and recommends denial of benefits. Margaret felt sick as she listened to the systematic breakdown of how classified veterans were being failed. She thought about David Washington, sitting in some VA waiting room being told that his trauma wasn't real because there was no official record of his heroism. We need to look at this from a different angle, she said. Instead of trying to fix the system for individual cases, we need to change how the system handles classified service records entirely. We need a separate review process for veterans with classified service. Colonel Williams nodded thoughtfully. What would that look like in practice? Margaret moved back to the whiteboard and began sketching out a process flow. First, we need a way to identify veterans with classified service during their initial claim. Veterans would indicate on their application that portions of their service record are classified, which would trigger a different review process, she continued, drawing connections on the board. Second, we need caseworkers with security clearances who can access the real service records. These reviewers would be specifically trained to understand the nature of classified operations and how they're documented. Third, Major Kim added, picking up on Margaret's thinking, we need psychological evaluators who are cleared to review classified service records and understand the unique trauma associated with covert operations. Dr. Bidbar 501. Hayes was furiously taking notes. The psychological evaluation criteria would need to be completely different for classified veterans. The trauma associated with operating under deep cover, maintaining false identities, and working in constant fear of exposure creates a different psychological profile than conventional combat stress. Linda Foster raised a practical concern. How do we implement something like this without exposing the very classified operations we're trying to protect?
If we create a separate track for classified veterans, we're essentially confirming the existence of operations that are supposed to remain secret.
Captain Torres had been thinking about this problem since they began their work. We can create review criteria based on classification levels rather than specific operations. Veterans with certain security clearances or assignment codes would automatically qualify for the specialized review process without revealing what they actually did. Margaret was excited by the direction their discussion was taking. For the first time since beginning this work, she could see a path forward that would actually help veterans while protecting national security. We also need to address the retroactive cases, she said. Every veteran who is wrongfully denied benefits because of classification issues deserves to have their case reopened and properly reviewed. That's going to be a massive undertaking, Colonel Williams warned. We're talking about potentially thousands of cases that would need to be completely re-evaluated. Then we make it a massive undertaking, Margaret replied firmly. These veterans served their country under the most difficult circumstances imaginable. They maintain their cover so effectively that our own government doesn't recognize their service. They deserve whatever resources it takes to make this right. Hayes looked up from his notes. I'd like to propose something additional. We should create a specialized treatment program for classified veterans dealing with PTSD and other service-related psychological issues. The standard treatment protocols don't account for the unique stresses these veterans experienced. What kind of specialized treatment? Colonel Williams asked. Traditional PTSD treatment assumes that veterans can talk openly about their traumatic experiences with therapists. But classified veterans can't discuss the details of their service, which makes standard therapy approaches less effective. We need treatment methods that can address trauma without requiring veterans to violate their security oaths. Margaret realized that Dr. Hayes had identified another critical gap in how the system served classified veterans. That's brilliant. How many classified veterans are probably suffering from untreated psychological trauma because they can't access appropriate care? The room fell silent as everyone contemplated the implications. Margaret thought about her own struggles with nightmares and anxiety, problems that had worsened over the years because she couldn't discuss the source of her trauma with civilian therapists. I want to propose something, Margaret said, standing again. I think we should reach out directly to the veterans we've identified as wrongfully denied. Instead of waiting for the system to be fixed, let's contact them and explain what we're doing. Many of these veterans probably think they're fighting this battle alone. Major Kim looked concerned. There are operational security implications to contacting veterans about their classified service. We're not asking them to reveal classified information, Margaret replied. We're telling them that someone finally understands the real nature of their service and that we're working to fix the system that failed them. Colonel Williams considered the proposal carefully. It's risky, but I think Margaret's right. These veterans deserve to know that someone is fighting for them. Let's develop a protocol for outreach that protects operational security while giving these veterans hope. Linda Foster had been quiet for most of the discussion, but now she spoke up with passion. I've been working with veterans for 20 years, and I've never seen a more systematic betrayal of people who served their country. These veterans gave up everything, including the right to be publicly recognized for their service, and our response has been to deny them the support they earned.
Margaret felt a deep sense of kinship with Linda's anger.
That's exactly why we're here. Every veteran in those files trusted the system to take care of them when their service was over. We broke that trust, and now we have to earn it back. As the meeting concluded, Margaret looked around the room at the team that had assembled to tackle this problem. Each person brought different expertise and perspectives, but they all shared a commitment to fixing a system that had failed some of America's most dedicated servants.
One more thing, Margaret said as the team began packing up their files.
We need to be prepared for resistance. There are people in the bureaucracy who will see our efforts as criticism of their work. There are officials who will worry about the cost of providing benefits to thousands of additional veterans.
We need to be ready to fight for every case, every policy change, every resource allocation.
Colonel Williams nodded grimly. Margaret's right. This won't be easy, and it won't be quick. But we have something more powerful than bureaucratic inertia. We have the truth on our side, and we have the stories of veterans who deserve better than what they've received. As Margaret gathered her files and prepared to leave, she thought about David Washington and the hundreds of other veterans whose cases were stacked in boxes around the room.
Each file represented a person who had served with honor and been forgotten by the system they protected.
But now, for the first time in years, those veterans had advocates who understood the true nature of their service. The Insignia might have been hidden for decades, but Margaret Chen and her team were finally ready to bring those hidden heroes into the light. 2 months after the task force began its work, Margaret Chen found herself in the most unlikely of places, The Pentagon's executive briefing room, preparing to present her findings to a three-star general who had the power to either approve comprehensive reforms or bury their efforts in bureaucratic red tape. General Robert Harrison had served as Deputy Chief of Staff for Personnel for the past 3 years, overseeing military personnel policies that affected millions of service members and veterans. His reputation was that of a by-the-books officer who valued efficiency and order above all else. Margaret knew that convincing him would require more than emotional appeals. She would need hard data and practical solutions. Colonel Williams had arranged the briefing after their task force had completed its initial investigation into classified veterans' benefits denials. The findings were even more damaging than Margaret had initially suspected, revealing not just individual injustices, but a systematic failure that had been operating for over 2 decades. General Harrison, thank you for agreeing to this briefing. Colonel Williams began as the general entered the room, followed by his aide and 2 other senior officers. I believe the information we're about to present will significantly impact how the military handles veterans' affairs. General Harrison was a tall, imposing man with steel grey hair and the kind of bearing that commanded instant respect. He took his seat at the head of the conference table and opened a folder that his aide placed before him. Colonel Williams, I've read your preliminary report. I have to say, the allegations you're making are quite serious. You're essentially claiming that the Veterans Administration has been systematically discriminating against our most sensitive personnel. Margaret stood and moved to the presentation screen, feeling the weight of hundreds of classified veteran stories resting on her shoulders. General, what we've discovered isn't discrimination in the traditional sense. It's the unintended consequence of security measures that were designed to protect national interests, but have ended up betraying the people who made the greatest sacrifices to protect those interests. She clicked to the first slide, which showed statistics comparing benefit denial rates for different categories of veterans. Sir, veterans with conventional military occupational specialties have an 18% denial rate for disability benefits. Veterans whose service involved classified operations have a 67% denial rate. This isn't a small statistical variation. It's evidence of a fundamental flaw in how we evaluate service-related claims. General Harrison studied the numbers with a frown. Ms. Chen, these statistics are concerning, but they don't necessarily prove systematic bias. Veterans with classified assignments might simply be more likely to exaggerate their claims, knowing that their service can't be easily verified. Margaret had anticipated this response. She clicked to the next slide, which showed psychological evaluation data comparing classified and conventional veterans. Sir, we had independent psychologists review a sample of denied claims without knowing which category the veterans fell into. When evaluating based solely on clinical criteria, not service records, the psychologists found that classified veterans actually showed higher rates of legitimate PTSD and service-related trauma than conventional veterans. Dr. Hayes, who had joined the briefing via video conference from his office, spoke up. General, what we're seeing is that classified veterans are being penalized for the effectiveness of their cover stories. The more successfully they maintain their operational security during service, the more likely they are to be denied benefits as veterans. General Harrison's expression shifted slightly, showing the first sign that he was taking their findings seriously. Doctor, are you saying that veterans are being punished for following orders to maintain operational security? That's exactly what I'm saying, sir. These veterans followed their orders so well that our own bureaucracy can't recognize their... Margaret clicked to the next slide, which displayed a map of the United States with red dots marking the locations of wrongfully denied claims. The dots were clustered around major military installations and intelligence facilities, creating a clear geographic pattern. General, this map shows the home locations of veterans we've identified as wrongfully denied benefits due to classification issues. Notice how they cluster around installations where classified operations are based. This isn't random. It's a pattern that directly correlates with assignments to sensitive units and operations. Colonel Williams pulled out a thick folder and placed it on the table in front of General Harrison. Sir, I'd like you to review a specific case that illustrates the problem we're addressing. This is the file of Staff Sergeant Maria Rodriguez, who served with distinction in classified intelligence operations from 2003 to 2019. General Harrison opened the folder and began reading. Margaret watched his expression carefully, noting when his eyebrows raised slightly as he encountered the discrepancies between Rodriguez's official and classified records. According to the official record, General Harrison said slowly, Staff Sergeant Rodriguez served as a communications technician, primarily at stateside installations, But this classified addendum indicates she operated covert communication networks in Afghanistan, Iraq, and Pakistan, often working alone in hostile territory. That's correct, sir, Margaret replied. Rodriguez's official record shows no combat deployments, no hazardous duty assignments, and no decorations for valor, but her classified record documents 17 months of combat operations, 3 separate injuries from enemy action, and a silver star that can't be publicly acknowledged. General Harrison continued reading, his frown deepening as he absorbed the details of Rodriguez's actual service. It says here that she was captured by hostile forces in Pakistan and held for 6 days before escaping. That incident isn't mentioned anywhere in her official record, because acknowledging it would compromise ongoing intelligence operations, Colonel Williams explained. Rodriguez maintained her cover so effectively that she was able to continue operating in the region for another 2 years after her escape. But now that she's seeking disability benefits for the psychological trauma from that capture, there's no official documentation to support her claim. Margaret moved to stand beside the general, pointing to specific sections of Rodriguez's file. Sir, Rodriguez applied for disability benefits 18 months ago, claiming PTSD and physical injuries related to her service. The VA reviewer saw a communications technician with no combat experience and flagged her claim as potentially fraudulent. She was denied benefits and is currently working 3 part-time jobs to support herself and her disabled mother. What was her psychological evaluation like?
General Harrison asked, clearly disturbed by what he was reading.
Dr. Hayes answered from the video screen. The VA psychologist found inconsistencies between Rodriguez's reported trauma and her official service record. The psychologist concluded that Rodriguez was either fabricating her experiences or suffering from false memories. The evaluation recommended denial of benefits and suggested that Rodriguez might be coached by advocacy groups trying to game the system. General Harrison closed the folder and sat back in his chair, clearly processing the implications of what he had learned. Gentlemen, Miss Chen, what you're describing is not just a bureaucratic failure. This is a betrayal of the fundamental compact between the military and its personnel. Margaret felt a surge of hope. General Harrison was beginning to understand the magnitude of the problem they were addressing. General, Maria Rodriguez is just one example, she said. We've documented over 2,000 similar cases, and we believe there are many more veterans who haven't even applied for benefits because they assume they won't be believed. Colonel Williams leaned forward. Sir, we've developed a comprehensive proposal for addressing this problem. It involves creating a separate review process for veterans with classified service, training specialized caseworkers and psychologists, and implementing retroactive reviews of all previously denied claims. General Harrison studied the faces around the table, clearly weighing the political and practical implications of what was being proposed. The scope of what you're suggesting would be enormous. We're talking about potentially overturning thousands of benefit decisions, training new personnel, and creating entirely new administrative procedures. Yes, sir, Margaret replied without hesitation. But we're also talking about honoring the commitment we made to these veterans when they agreed to serve in classified capacities. They trusted us to take care of them when their service was over, and we failed to keep that promise. The general's aide whispered something in his ear, and Harrison nodded before responding.
Mizzou.
Chen, I understand you have personal experience with this issue. Your own benefits claim was initially denied, correct?
Yes, sir.
I was told by a VA caseworker that my service record didn't support my claims and that I was probably exaggerating my experiences to get better benefits. It took intervention from the Inspector General's office to get my case properly reviewed. And what was the outcome of that proper review? I was immediately approved for full disability benefits with back pay. The reviewing officer said my case was one of the most clear-cut disability claims she had ever seen, but only after she had access to my complete service record. General Harrison stood and walked to the window overlooking the Pentagon's central courtyard. Margaret could see him weighing the decision, understanding that approving their recommendations would be both expensive and politically challenging. Miss Chen, in your opinion, how many veterans like yourself are currently being failed by the system? Margaret chose her words carefully. Sir, based on our research, I estimate that between 2,000 and 3,000 veterans with classified service records have been wrongfully denied benefits. But the real impact is broader than that. We have an unknown number of classified veterans who haven't even applied for benefits because they've heard about cases like mine and assume it's pointless to try.
And the cost of implementing your recommendations?
Colonel Williams had prepared for this question. Sir, the immediate cost of retroactive benefit payments would be approximately $40 million. The ongoing cost of the specialized review process would be about $12 million annually, but we need to compare that to the cost of continuing to fail these veterans. General Harrison turned back to face the group. What do you mean by that? Margaret stepped forward. Sir, these veterans are currently receiving no support for service-related injuries and trauma. Many are struggling financially, some are homeless, and others are dealing with untreated psychological issues. The social and economic costs of continuing to ignore their needs will far exceed the cost of providing proper benefits, Dr. Hayes added. General, we're also seeing secondary effects on these veterans' families. When a veteran can't get treatment for PTSD or support for service-related disabilities, the entire family suffers. We're potentially creating a generation of military families who feel betrayed by the system they served. General Harrison returned to his seat and pulled out a legal pad, beginning to write notes. I want to understand the security implications of what you're proposing. If we create a separate track for classified veterans, are we potentially exposing sensitive operations? Captain Torres, who had been quiet throughout the briefing, spoke up. Sir, we've designed the process to protect operational security while still providing proper benefits review. Veterans would be identified by security clearance levels and assignment codes, not by specific operations. The specialized caseworkers would have appropriate clearances, but wouldn't need to know operational details to verify service-related injuries. And the psychological evaluation process? Dr. Hayes responded. Sir, we're proposing treatment and evaluation methods that can address classified trauma without requiring veterans to violate their security oaths. The focus would be on clinical symptoms rather than operational details. General Harrison continued writing notes, occasionally asking clarifying questions about specific aspects of their proposal. Margaret could sense that he was genuinely engaged with the problem and seriously considering their recommendations. Ms. Chen, I want to ask you a personal question, the general said suddenly. Why are you doing this? You've already received your benefits. You could walk away from this issue and move on with your life. Margaret had been waiting for this question throughout the briefing. Sir, because I know what it feels like to sit in a VA office being told that your service didn't matter, that your injuries aren't real, that you're probably lying about your experiences. I know what it's like to feel forgotten by the country you served. No veteran should have to go through that experience, especially veterans who sacrificed their right to public recognition in order to serve in classified capacities. She paused, gathering her thoughts. Sir, these veterans followed orders to maintain their cover so effectively that they became invisible to their own government. They trusted us to remember their service even when they couldn't talk about it publicly. We owe them better than what they've received. General Harrison set down his pen and looked directly at Margaret. Ms. Chen, what you're describing represents a failure at the highest levels of military leadership. We asked these personnel to serve in ways that would make their contributions invisible, but we failed to ensure they would be properly cared for when their service ended. Yes, sir, that's exactly what happened. The general stood and walked to a flag display at the side of the room, studying the colors in silence for several moments. When he turned back to face the group, his expression was resolute. Colonel Williams, I want a detailed implementation plan on my desk within 2 weeks, include timelines, resource requirements, and protocols for maintaining operational security throughout the process. I'm prepared to recommend approval of your entire proposal to the Secretary of Defense. Margaret felt her heart racing. After months of work and years of frustration, they were finally getting the support they needed to fix the system. Sir, she said, what about the veterans who are currently waiting for their cases to be reviewed? Some of them have been fighting this battle for years. General Harrison's expression softened slightly. Ms. Chen, I want you to personally contact every veteran we've identified as wrongfully denied. Tell them that their cases are being reopened immediately and that they'll receive expedited review under the new procedures. Tell them that their service has been recognized and that we're going to make this right. As the briefing concluded and the participants began gathering their materials, General Harrison approached Margaret directly.
Miss Manny.
Chen, I want you to know that reading about cases like yours and Staff Sergeant Rodriguez has been deeply disturbing to me. The military's first obligation is to its people, and we clearly failed in that obligation. You have my personal commitment that we're going to fix this system and ensure it never fails classified veterans again.
Margaret felt tears welling up in her eyes as she shook the general's hand.
Thank you, sir. This means everything to the veterans we're fighting for. As Margaret left the Pentagon that afternoon, she thought about Maria Rodriguez working 3 jobs to support herself and her mother. She thought about David Washington being told his trauma wasn't real. She thought about the hundreds of other classified veterans who had given everything for their country and been forgotten by the system they protected. But now, for the first time in years, Margaret had real hope that those veterans would finally receive the recognition and support they had earned.
The general had seen through the bureaucratic maze to recognize the human cost of the system's failures. He had spotted the hidden insignia that others had missed or ignored.
The battle wasn't over, but Margaret knew they had finally found an ally with the authority and determination to win it. 6 months after her meeting with General Harrison, Margaret Chen stood before a podium in the Pentagon's Hall of Heroes, looking out at an audience that included dozens of classified veterans who had been wrongfully denied benefits, their families, military leadership, and media representatives. The event had been carefully orchestrated to balance public recognition with operational security, acknowledging sacrifices that had been hidden for decades while protecting information that remained sensitive. The past months had been a whirlwind of activity as the Department of Defense implemented the Classified Veterans Recognition and Support Act, legislation that had passed Congress with overwhelming bipartisan support after General Harrison's recommendations reached the highest levels of government. Margaret had worked 18-hour days coordinating the review of over 2,000 cases, training new specialized caseworkers, and developing treatment protocols for veterans dealing with classified trauma. Behind her on the stage sat Colonel Williams, General Harrison, and Secretary of Defense Patricia Morrison, who had personally championed the legislation after being briefed on the task force's findings. To Margaret's right, a display honored the memory of classified veterans who had died while waiting for proper recognition of their service, including Master Sergeant James Thompson, whose suicide note had mentioned his despair over being called a fraud by VA officials who couldn't understand his classified service. "Ladies and gentlemen," Margaret began, her voice carrying clearly through the hall's sound system. 18 months ago, I sat in a VA office being told that my 32 years of military service didn't matter because my official record showed only administrative duties. The caseworker looking at my file couldn't see the real story of my service, the operations I supported, the risks I took, or the injuries I sustained in the line of duty. She saw only what the system allowed her to see, and based on that incomplete picture, she dismissed my claims as exaggerated or fraudulent. Margaret paused, making eye contact with veterans in the audience whose own stories mirrored her experience. Today, I stand before you as Senior Advisor on Classified Veterans Affairs, a position that exists because we proved that the system had systematically failed thousands of veterans whose service was hidden behind necessary security classifications. But more importantly, I stand here as proof that when the truth finally comes to light, justice can prevail. She gestured toward the audience, where veterans who had been fighting for recognition for years sat next to family members who had never fully understood the true nature of their loved one's service. In the past 6 months, we have reopened and properly reviewed over 2,000 cases of veterans with classified service records. Of those cases, 91% have been approved for full disability benefits with retroactive payments. The average back payment has been $43,000, money that these veterans should have received years ago when they first applied for help. Applause filled the hall, but Margaret could see that many of the veterans were too emotional to clap.
She recognized the look on their faces, the mixture of relief and vindication that comes when years of struggle finally result in acknowledgement.
But this isn't just about money or benefits, Margaret continued.
It's about recognition. It's about a country keeping its promise to the men and women who served in its most sensitive operations. It's about ensuring that classified veterans never again have to choose between maintaining their security oaths and receiving proper care for service-related injuries and trauma. Margaret turned toward the display behind her, which showed photographs of classified veterans alongside their newly declassified citations for valor.
These veterans served with distinction in operations that most Americans will never know about, in places that don't appear on official maps, under identities that weren't their own. They followed orders to remain invisible, to maintain cover stories so effective that even their own government forgot their real contributions.
She pointed to a photograph of Staff Sergeant Maria Rodriguez, who was sitting in the front row with her mother. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez spent 17 months operating covert communication networks in hostile territory, was captured and held for 6 days before escaping, and continued her mission for 2 more years. Her official record showed her as a stateside communications technician with no combat experience. For 3 years, she worked multiple jobs to support herself and her disabled mother, while the VA denied her disability claims as fraudulent. Rodriguez wiped tears from her eyes as the audience turned to acknowledge her. Margaret had personally delivered Rodriguez's approval letter and back payment check, a moment that both women would remember for the rest of their lives. Today, Staff Sergeant Rodriguez has been awarded full disability benefits, a retroactive payment of $56,000, and access to specialized treatment programs designed specifically for veterans with classified trauma. More importantly, her Silver Star, which had been classified for 15 years, has been declassified and will be presented to her today. General Harrison stood and moved to a podium beside Margaret, holding a blue case containing Rodriguez's Silver Star medal. Staff Sergeant Maria Rodriguez, please come forward. As Rodriguez walked to the stage, Margaret reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. The young VA clerk who had dismissed her claim would probably never understand the significance of what was happening in this hall, but the veterans present, their families, and the military leadership who had fought to implement these reforms understood completely. General Harrison opened the medal case and read from the citation. For gallantry in action against an enemy of the United States while serving in a classified capacity. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez displayed exceptional courage and devotion to duty while operating alone in hostile territory. When captured by enemy forces, she maintained operational security despite physical and psychological torture, protecting sensitive intelligence and ongoing operations. Her escape and continued mission execution exemplify the highest traditions of military service and reflect great credit upon herself, her unit, and the United States Army. As General Harrison pinned the Silver Star to Rodriguez's blazer, Margaret thought about all the other classified veterans whose valor had finally been acknowledged. David Washington had received his Bronze Star for courage under fire during intelligence operations. Technical Sergeant Lisa Park had been awarded the Distinguished Flying Cross for piloting classified reconnaissance missions. Master Sergeant Robert Kim had been posthumously awarded the Purple Heart for injuries sustained during covert operations, a medal his widow had waited 8 years to receive. Margaret returned to the podium as Rodriguez, overcome with emotion, was embraced by her mother. The Classified Veterans Recognition and Support Act has fundamentally changed how our government honors the service of its most sensitive personnel. We have established specialized review processes, trained caseworkers with appropriate security clearances, and created treatment protocols that respect both veterans' need for care and their obligations to maintain operational security. She gestured toward Dr. Hayes, who was sitting with a group of mental health professionals who had been trained in the new treatment methods. We have also revolutionized how we treat psychological trauma in classified veterans. Dr. Robert Hayes and his team have developed therapy techniques that can address combat stress and operational trauma without requiring veterans to violate their security oaths. Veterans can now receive proper mental health care while maintaining the confidentiality of their service. The audience included family members who had struggled to understand their loved ones' difficulties without knowing the true nature of their service. Margaret could see the relief on their faces as they finally had context for problems they had witnessed but couldn't comprehend. Perhaps most importantly, Margaret continued, we have established a permanent classified veterans advocacy office within the Department of Defense. This office will ensure that future classified veterans receive proper support from the moment they transition to civilian life, preventing the problems we've had to correct over the past months. Colonel Williams joined Margaret at the podium to announce the next phase of their work. We are also implementing the Classified Veterans Family Support Program, which provides counseling and support services to spouses and children of classified veterans. We recognize that operational security requirements often prevent classified personnel from sharing their experiences with their families, creating unique stresses that require specialized support. Margaret thought about her own daughter Sarah, who was sitting in the audience and had finally learned the truth about her mother's service. For years, Sarah had wondered why her mother had nightmares, why she couldn't talk about her work, why she seemed to carry burdens that couldn't be shared. Now, with appropriate security briefings and family counseling, Sarah understood that her mother's secrecy hadn't been a choice, but a requirement of her service. The veterans being honored today represent just the beginning of our efforts, Margaret said, her voice gaining strength. We are currently reviewing the cases of another 1,500 veterans who may have been affected by these systematic problems. We're also working with Congress to ensure that the Classified Veterans Recognition and Support Act receives permanent funding and legal protection. She paused, looking directly at the veterans in the audience. But beyond the individual cases, beyond the policy changes, beyond the institutional reforms, this effort represents something more fundamental. It represents a recognition that service comes in many forms, that heroism isn't always visible, and that a grateful nation remembers all of its defenders, even those whose contributions must remain in the shadows. Margaret gestured toward a new display that would become a permanent fixture in the Pentagon, honoring classified veterans whose service could finally be acknowledged. This memorial will serve as a reminder that behind every classified operation, behind every sensitive mission, behind every covert assignment, There are real people who risked everything for their country's security. These veterans maintained cover stories so effectively that they became invisible to their own government, but they will never be invisible to us again. As the ceremony concluded, Margaret watched as classified veterans and their families mingled with military leadership, sharing stories that had been locked away for years. She saw Rodriguez showing her silver star to her mother, who was finally learning the truth about her daughter's heroic service. She watched David Washington talking with other intelligence veterans, no longer isolated by the secrecy that had defined their service. General Harrison approached Margaret as the crowd began to disperse. Ms. Chen, 6 months ago you walked into my office with a problem that seemed almost impossible to solve. Today, we've not only solved that problem, but created a foundation for ensuring it never happens again. The military is better because of your work. Margaret smiled, feeling a sense of completion that had eluded her for years. General, this was never just about fixing a bureaucratic problem. It was about honoring a promise we made to these veterans when they agreed to serve in classified capacities. Today, we kept that promise. As Margaret prepared to leave the Pentagon that evening, she stopped at the new memorial honoring classified veterans. The display included a quote that had become the motto of her advocacy office. Some warriors fight in the light of day, while others serve in shadows. All deserve recognition, all deserve honor, all deserve remembrance. Margaret thought about the young VA clerk who had dismissed her so many months ago. That clerk had seen only what the system allowed her to see, making decisions based on incomplete information and assumptions about what military service looked like. But General Harrison had looked deeper, seeing beyond the sanitized records, to recognize the hidden insignia that marked real heroism. The classification stamps that had hidden these veterans' service for so long were finally being lifted, revealing stories of courage and sacrifice that deserve to be remembered. The insignia had been there all along, waiting for someone with the authority and wisdom to recognize its significance. Margaret Chen had spent decades serving her country in silence, her contributions hidden behind cover stories and security classifications. But now, as senior advisor on classified veterans affairs, she served in the light, ensuring that other classified veterans would never again be dismissed or forgotten. The warrior's insignia was finally visible, and it would never be hidden again. As Margaret walked out of the Pentagon for the last time in her official capacity, she carried with her the knowledge that thousands of classified veterans would now receive the recognition and support they had earned through their silent service. The battle for acknowledgement was over, but the commitment to honor all who serve would continue forever. Behind her, the Hall of Heroes stood as a testament to visible valor and recognized courage. Now, it also honored the invisible warriors whose insignia had finally been spotted by those wise enough to see beyond the surface, ensuring that no hero would ever again be dismissed as ordinary, simply because their extraordinary service had been successfully hidden from view. The general had spotted her hidden insignia and in doing so had revealed the insignia of thousands of others who had served their country with silent distinction. Their recognition was complete, their service acknowledged, their sacrifice honored. At last,